In the next 2 days. Today we're going to finish up chapter 1 and get through chapter 2 ideally in that period of time, and then our first exam is on Monday in this room at our regularly scheduled time based upon whatever we've covered. Should be 1 and 2. Any questions about the schedule? So, there we go. So we got through the sociological perspectives. Before we move on, are there any questions about the sociological perspective? It's really, really important that you understand the theories. Everybody feels comfortable with the theories, the perspectives, what they're trying to, how they're trying to manage the complexity of society? No question. Okay. We move on to the sociological imagination. One of the most important modern American, and I make that distinction because, as you know from the reading, sociology did not start in the United States. What part of the world does sociology start in? Europe, right? France, Germany, United Kingdom, those kinds of places, right? But this theory was developed by an American sociologist. Who developed this theory, this idea? Everybody's hand should be up because you all read the chapter in advance. You can look at your notes. You're getting close to the first exam. You're going to find out who's not. Who wrote the sociological imagination? Yes. C. Wright Mills. Charles Wright Mills. C. Wright Mills. He's known that, right? And in a sense, this idea ties to what we were just talking about with the sociological perspective. He doesn't talk about it that way, but you can think about it that way. And Mills was a conflict theorist. I gave you a list of who's important in each perspective. If you remember, Mills was listed as a conflict theorist, and he very much was one. He was a very radical theorist. He died just before the civil rights era. He would have been very much involved with it had he lived longer, I'm sure. And again, he writes this in 1959. He passes away shortly afterwards. And he writes the book, The Sociological Imagination. And again, this should be in your notes. You're going to have to move a little more quickly. So, his target audience was not students. It was not the general public. He was, as you'll see when we go through this course, he was a bit of an arrogant sociologist. He didn't have a lot of patience for the masses. And it wasn't that he didn't like them, he just didn't think that they were activist enough. He didn't think they were involved with the kind of radical restructuring of society that he and other conflict theorists obviously want to accomplish. So he writes this book instead. Are you in this class? Yeah. Grab plenty of seats down here. As I mentioned, nothing personal, but this is my 21st year of doing this. There is a distinct correlation between grades and where you sit in the class. Right? Generally, students who sit in the class don't do well. Just there tends to be a correlation. But maybe that won't be the case this semester. Okay. His target audience were scholars and intellectuals. He thought they could understand this stuff and then pass it down to the masses. And obviously, there's a lot more to this book. In my theory class, we go into a lot more detail, but I'm going to summarize it for you. He said that people are trapped in their own private orbits. What do you think that means? Yes?
People are
Okay, that's good. Who else? Okay. They're not focused on others, and they're not focused or not aware of the larger society and the impact that they have on others in society, right? So just the example that often comes up, you hear people who have like a drinking problem or some kind of addiction, and when they're confronted, they'll say, yeah, I have it, but I'm only hurting myself. You've heard that before? Right? It's my responsibility, I'm hurting myself. And we all know that's not true, right? They're hurting their family, they're hurting their coworkers, they're hurting the healthcare system, all those things, but they don't realize it. When they say they believe that, they don't realize that they're affecting those around them. And that's what Mills was talking about. He said a lot of the problems in society, a lot of the conflict in society is a function of the fact that people are trapped in their own private orbits and they don't understand the impact they're having on the wider society. So, I'll give you 3 ways from his book that you can think of in a little more detail the sociological method. 1, he said, the sociological imagination is a vivid awareness of the relationship between one's own experience and the wider society. Right? The impact that people are having, but they're trapped in their own private orbits, which means they're going around and around and around. What the orbit is, right? Going around and around without, and unless something stops it, it's never going to get out of the orbit. Right? Like the moon, for example. Right? Just keep going around and around and around. And you can understand it, right? We're all trapped in our own private orbits to some degree, especially when you're on a schedule. Right? You have this class at 9:30, you have another class maybe at 11:40, you have another class maybe at 2, something like that, right? And you don't necessarily see what's going on around you because you're trapped. Does that make sense? Right? We can all relate to it to a certain degree, but he believed that some people are completely trapped. Another way of thinking about the sociological imagination is what he referred to as the intersection between one's own biography and societal history. The intersection, where they meet. Any questions? Your own biography, your life history, right? The intersection between your own experiences and how it intersects with the larger societal history. And so, and I don't want to use you because this is about people that are doing, creating problems in society, right? But if you take this person with an addiction problem, and obviously you want to get them help and everything, but a lot of times they don't want help or they'll resist help or they'll say it's all about, my responsibility and if I get sick, whatever. And they don't understand that it affects, there's a domino effect, right? Particularly, for example, if they have children. Because now the children may become out, addicted because they see that kind of behavior. It's called differential association theory in criminology, right? If you're exposed to people that do deviant things, you will likely do deviant things. So there's this ripple effect that's going to create that affect history around, not only in the family, but outside of the family. Does that make sense? Okay. Any other questions? And the third way is the ability to see society as an outsider would. So what this means is Mills believed that it is very difficult to be objective about your own situation. But if you're an outsider to another situation, you can be very objective, right? Two people are having a disagreement about something, and you walk over and you have nothing invested in it, and they say to you, what do you think about my argument? What do you think about the other argument? it's easy to be objective about it. But when you're in the situation yourself, it's very hard to be objective about it, right? I'm sure you've had disagreements with people and you felt you were 100% right and they were 100% wrong, and it was hard for you to understand their point of view, right? It's kind of human nature. Mills believed that if people could take the position of being an outsider in all situations, they could be more objective and be more enlightened members of society, adopt this sociological imagination, and conflict and inequality would be alleviated. Mills was a conflict theorist. He wanted a radical restructuring of society to eliminate conflict, but instead of taking the position that Marx took, which was let's have this bloody revolution where people, the underclass rose up and literally fought the upper class, and there were going to be deaths and all kinds of things, he believed scholarship was the way to achieve the same kind of radical restructuring of society. By writing this book, by having scholars explain it to people, and by having people adopt this position. Understanding all this, he believed was going to be the way to eliminate conflict. Any questions? Okay. We're going to skip some of this stuff, because, well, I'll just mention this. The first chapter is called The Promise. You do need to know that. I'm not going to go through all the details. The first chapter is called The Promise, and the first few words in the first chapter is about the fact that he believed that people were trapped in their own private orbits. And what he meant by the promise was that he promised that if people adopted these ideas, understood the fact that they were involved with impacting the wider society, the world would be less full of conflict. That was, he thought, the promise was. Okay? Any questions? Okay, so we'll skip some stuff here, because I think you got what I want you to know, and what, in addition to what you can read. All right, so next thing I want to cover from chapter 1 is social construction. This becomes a very important concept in the course in a lot of different ways. It's the idea that things are socially constructed. What does that mean? For those of you who did the reading. Yes. Okay. We talked about social order in a couple of different perspectives. Thank you. Anybody else? Yes. Gender would be an example. Money is an example. Race is an example. Right? All these things are examples of how society constructs the ideas and the definitions of things. So it raises the question, is human nature, human behavior natural, or is it a result of construction? We'll go through some examples of that. Is it what society determines it to be, instead of there being a natural reason for it? The chapter talks about how there's a basic flaw in human reasoning that essentially says we believe things to be inevitable. Not a result of how society interprets it. People believe that things are natural and cannot be changed. What sociology does teach us in many ways is that we are freer than we think, and that the things we think are natural can be created by human beings. So let's talk about money for a second, as an example, right? So you get a $20 bill. Everybody knows we start at 9:30, correct? Excuse me. You know we start at 9:30? You know, we started you get a $20 bill. It's a piece of paper with ink on it, right? Why is it worth anything? Somebody says so, right? There is no value to the piece of paper, very little value to the piece of paper with ink on it, right? It doesn't, you can't do much with it. You can't build anything with it, right? You can, you know, you can't, there's nothing rare about it. You can say gold might be different because it's rare, right? Or diamonds might be different because it's rare. Even that has construction to it, right? But because society determines that that piece of paper with ink on it has a certain value, it has a certain value, right? You walk into a store and there's a price on something, they've determined that's the price, the value of it. Doesn't mean that that's really the value. And then people determine through supply and demand if they're going to buy it and whether the price is going to go up or going to go down, right? Kind of like how the stock market works, right? A share of, you know, IBM stock is what the market determines it to be. You think it's valuable to you, you buy it, the price goes up, you sell it, the price goes down. Just constructed like that. There's nothing real about the share of stock. Nothing natural about it. So again, we're going to be talking about this in this course in a lot of the stratification areas, race, class, and gender, things like that. And this is a good way of understanding. Any questions? Talk a little bit about social order when we talked about some of the perspectives. Who can remind us how social order is maintained in the conflict perspective? Okay. Through domination or force, right? By whom? The ones who have the most political, social, and other kinds of importance, right? Very good. So, understanding and maintaining social order is critical in society because if you don't have social order, what do you have? You have anarchy, right? And that's never good. So the question that is raised by the textbook is, how is social order maintained? We know how it's maintained, at least ideally, by conflict theorists, but it's a larger question. Is it a result of rational self-interest, as we talked about in rational choice theory? Is it that people will maintain social order because they believe that's what's in their best interest? Is it because social norms have been established and people don't want to deviate? We're going to talk a lot about social norms and social values in this course. They're not interchangeable, right? Think somebody could explain what social norms are? Socially acceptable relative to the social setting, right? You're correct about the first part. The last part is very important. It's what expected in relative to the social setting. So,
what if it happens to like the normal to the setting?
To the setting, right? What's the expected behavior. So I'm looking around the room, I don't see anybody who's dressed inappropriately for a lecture course. In this setting, it's fine, but how many of you would go to a job interview with what you're dressed in today? You would? Okay, one. Right? And that's fine, but most people would say they're not, right? Because it's a different social setting. How many of you would go dressed like this to your own wedding? You get the point, right? The behavior could be the same, but the social setting determines what the social norms are. Social values are different. And we're not going to talk about them now, but I just want to distinguish between the two of them. Somebody think they can explain what a social value is and how that's different than norm? Because you see it in the textbook and all over the place, and they seem to be the same thing or discussed together. Norms and values. You had your hand up, yeah. Yeah, so Correct, but that's a good example. But the definition would be the abstract ideas of right and wrong. What's right and what's wrong. So obviously murder is wrong, right? Well, and that's kind of universal. But that's not all things are universally, people have all same universal values. That's one. Lots of really terrible things are like that. But I'll give you one example we're going to talk about later in the course. So in the United States, you're only allowed to marry one person at a time, right? You can only be married legally to one person at a time. You can divorce them and get married again, but you can't be married to two or more people legally in the United States. But in other countries and in other cultures, that's perfectly fine. In fact, it's kind of normal, right? Depending on what part of the world you're in. So it's normal there, it's within the social norms there, it's outside of the social norms here, it's the same behavior. So it's relative to the culture in many ways. Now you're right, there are some universal social norms like that, but not everything. A lot of things are culturally relative. Okay. Social order may be maintained through power and domination. We talked about that in the conflict view. Maybe that's the reason why social order is maintained. You know, you hear about all this crime in the world, and it's terrible, but for the most part, people maintain social order, right? For the most part. You hear about crime, 22 out of every 100,000, 22 out of every 1,000. It's not 1,000 out of 1,000, right? Thankfully. So, why is social order maintained? For the most part, it is. And again, it depends on where you're looking. But, there are baseball games going on across the United States. 50,000 people come into a stadium. And for the most part, they eat their hot dogs, they yell and boo, and they drink their beer, and then they go home, and you never hear about riots at baseball games. Why? Well, we have to figure out why, right? But you see the point? For the most part, for the most part, people don't break the rules. At least not in a serious way. Okay. Or is it some other factor? Any questions? Yes? Well, we had talked about the conflict theory, so it's a two-class system between those who have social resources and those who do not. That's the yeah. Okay. Let's do it, and then we'll get into the theorists and the theories, and hopefully get to chapter 2 sooner than later. Who can tell us what human agency means? This relates to some of the things that we have been talking about. Yeah. Free will. Yeah. Why are you here? Right? Literally, why are you here today in this class? Is it your own free will? Is this what you chose? Or was it a series of events that led you here without you really having a lot of control over the situation? Right? Did you leave high school? Did you go through high school and say, gee, I really want to go to UAlbany? Or did you apply to a bunch of schools and this was the best of what you got accepted to, and you go, okay, it's affordable, and my brother went here, or my parents went here, and all kind of stuff. So this was life kind of pushed you in this direction. And that's not a criticism at all. It's the question, right? Or did you say, gee, I went through the rankings and I said, well, everything about this school seems to fit what I'm interested in. That's where I want to go. That would be more along the lines of human agency. But if life kind of pushed you in this direction, then that would be something else. Any questions about that? So, are your actions, are your choices a matter of free will? Or determinism. Determinism means the domino effect, right? Something happens to cause something else to happen, to cause something else to happen, and that's why you're here. Right? Sociologists are interested in that. Okay. That is essentially what you need to know for that. Because that comes up later in the course. All right, I think we're going to skip ahead to let me just see what's next. We're going to move on to the theorists, because that will help us get to chapter 2. Any questions? We can move on from this. You can read about that. Okay, let's get to the origins of society. If we skip something, that just means it was in the textbook and you should read it. Because we can't get that. So, there are two main time periods that led to the development of sociology. First is the Age of Enlightenment in the 18th century. What does that mean? What was the Age of Enlightenment? Yeah. The development of scientific thought as a change, as opposed to what? What was dominating human thought before? Religion, right? Religious rules, religious dogma, kind of determined how the rules that people had, the social norms, and then in the Age of Enlightenment, it was more an exploration of scientific thought. That was a big step in the direction of sociology. So philosophers developed general principles that could be used to explain social life, as opposed to religious guidelines, religious rules. And then the other period or change in society is one we talked about already. What did I say was the most important change in society that led to development of sociology? The Industrial Revolution. 19th century, beginning of the 19th century. And this shift from the rural, farm-based, agrarian, agricultural jobs to the cities, to the urban manufacturing jobs, increased social mobility. That really, it really means two things, actually. It increased mobility because transportation became much more available, right? Trains and other forms of steam engines and things like that. But also social mobility, right? The ability to rise through the social classes. Because now people had jobs that paid better than what they were making before. And for all the criticisms of capitalism and industrialization, it brought more wealth to more people than at any other time in the history of the world. Maybe not equally, but to some degree. And new kinds of employment means they used to work on farms and now they had opportunities to work in factories, which is not necessarily the most pleasant thing, but there were lots of jobs that were available. And since technology was phasing out human labor on farms, it was good that people had some kind of jobs to turn to. Any questions? So these two time periods were critical, the Industrial Revolution even a little bit more so, but both of them were important. Any questions? But of course you know this when you read. Okay? All right. Also, as I mentioned last time, the change was not just economic, it was also social, the way people interact with each other, and the end of empires like the Ottoman Empire. Believe it or not, the Ottoman Empire ended essentially at the same time around the end of World War I, which is hard to believe because it had lasted so long. You think about it in distant history, but it actually really ended around the time of World War I, which is, you got grandparents and great-grandparents, who lived during those times. So it wasn't that long ago in the scheme of things. Okay? So now we're going to get to the theorists, which are the last important part. Yes, question? Did somebody say something? Again, we're going to move a little more quickly because all this is covered in the chapter. A few more seconds, but again, this is all stuff you should have in your notes. Okay, always have that too. So millions of people moved into cities. Urbanization has a strong correlation to industrialization. There really weren't very significantly established cities prior to this. And with all these people moving into cities, or when it became cities, cities became much more significant. Any questions? Okay. I was serious to jot out these notes. It's just going over. So we start with the first theorist, Auguste Comte. It's pronounced Comte, not Comte. Comte lived, and I don't usually spend a lot of time on years, but question? I hear people talking. Is there a question? Steve? Okay, question. Look at the year of his birth. You don't have to be a history major to know there was stuff going on in the world around that time, just before his birth. What was going on in the world a few years before Comte's birth? What kind of world was he born into? Well, the Industrial Revolution came a little bit later. Right? The American Revolution, 1776, the French Revolution, a few years later, that one would affect him being a French philosopher. But yeah, there's a lot of turmoil and turnover and radical restructuring of society right before Comte was born, which led him to think this is not the best way for society to be sustainable, right? You can't have all this change. He wasn't a conflict theorist, right? Marx might have said good, he didn't think it was good. So he was born in France, and obviously this is the beginning of the explanation of where sociology began. And he developed the term sociology, but he didn't call it sociology first. First of all, he didn't write anything in English, so he didn't call it anything in English. But through translation, what did he first call sociology? Yes. Not social science, it's social physics, right? He first called it social physics because he liked the discipline, the objectivity of physics. He thought that people who were using philosophy were interpreting things too much. And they were coming up with very different answers. But no matter how different you are with another person's life, right? You may socially and culturally have very big differences with them. You'll never agree on things, but if you both go into a physics lab and roll a ball bearing down a plank of wood and measure acceleration, no matter how different people are, they're always going to get the same answer because there's objectivity to it, right? You could be so much different than this person, but mathematically and scientifically, you're going to find the same answer. Everybody clear about that? So he liked that.
So is he where we got the idea of the domino effect?
Not directly. That was more from the Vietnam War. But anyway, well, not exactly. No, but it's not directly correlated. So he wanted to build a social science that was similar to the natural science of physics. So he calls it social physics, but he calls it that in French. And he writes this work, a 6-volume work called The Course on Positive Philosophy. And as you know from the reading, another sociologist who played a critical role in the development of sociology was the first female sociologist, Harriet Barnett. And while and we're going to talk about her too, and you can read about her, she made a lot of contributions to sociology through her research. What she's best known for was translating and disseminating to the United States and other parts of the world Kant's original ideas on sociology. So you see, it's now called positive philosophy. So sociology was first called social physics, then he changes the idea or the terminology to positive philosophy, same thing. And then he calls it sociology through translation, same thing. So if you see any of those, and another term that also is very similar. Anybody remember from the reading what other term? Is it there? No, it's not there. What other term did you encounter that was related to this that Tom used? Yes. Positivism. Positivism. Thank you. Correct. So if you see sociology, social physics, positive philosophy, or positivism, they're all versions of the same thing. What we now call sociology. But he was working this stuff out, right? He would just have all these ideas immediately. So now you know a little bit about where his ideas came from, and I want to spend a bit going over what he covered in this first book. We're obviously not going to spend time on all 6 volumes, but there are a couple of things that I think is useful, are useful. Oops. So one takeaway from course in positive philosophy, or the first work in development of sociology, was what he called the law of 3 stages. Anybody remember what that was about? The law of 3 stages was that he thought that all societies move through 3 stages. All societies begin in a theological stage, in a religious stage. And he thought that was dangerous because people relied on supernatural agencies to explain things that they couldn't explain otherwise, which means that a lot of people might have different interpretations of religious doctrines, or religious documents, or books, or whatever they were using. And he thought that wouldn't lead to a lot of stability in society. That's where he thought a lot of the problems were. And we just got finished talking about how that was largely what the Age of Enlightenment was about. And then look, it's the 18th century, right? At least a little. At least the first couple of years. So he said all societies begin in a theological stage, a religious stage. But he said they shouldn't stay there. Now, obviously, there are some that are still there today, right? But he said all societies should move away from that. And he said the interim stage, the next stage, is, okay, so before we get to that. He believed this was the least scientific or rational stage. Rational means efficient or logical. So he was not in favor of a theological society. He said over time, society should move to a more scientific stage, but in the meantime, there is this interim stage, this in-between stage. This temporary stage, he believed all societies transitioned into what he called the metaphysical stage. And here, people make decisions not based upon religious rules, but not yet on the basis of scientific rules. They do things that are metaphysical. Metaphysical are sort of things that are hard to explain. Ouija boards, magic, those kinds of unverified kind of things, right? And then, over time, if they read his 6 volumes of positive philosophy, he believed ultimately societies would move to what he referred to as the positive stage. And he believed this one was the most rational, the most efficient or logical, or scientific stage. Where things were very clearly scientifically explained. So one example was it 2 years ago, we had that eclipse in the summer? It wasn't this summer, it was the one before, right? How do you think, so obviously, in a positive stage, scientists can explain when the eclipse is coming, how long it's going to last, the effects if you look into the sun, and when it's coming back next time, right? With great precision. How do you think a purely theological society would explain an eclipse? Yeah. Likely they would explain some supernatural news. And that's fine. But he thought the danger was what? What's the danger of that? Yes. It's, well, that too, right. They could get injured themselves. But more importantly, or equally important, yeah. It's unproven. But there also might be people that will take advantage of it, right? Say, oh, give me all your money, or I'll have God do it again, cut out the lights. It's possible people could be exploited. So that was what he thought was dangerous about. Not that people shouldn't believe in religion, but he thought there was a danger of people exploiting it. Those are the 3 stages he talked about in Course on Positive Philosophy. That's one of the things he worked on as he developed the new sociology, new field of sociology. Any questions? Yes. I'm sorry? We'll see. I'm hoping so. We'll see. You should be prepared for it, though, because if we don't, then you'll be ready to. Okay. The other takeaway from the Course on Positive Philosophy was, there's a lot more to this, obviously, but the other thing that I wanted to go over fairly briefly was what he referred to as the 2 main branches of sociology. And this is going to seem, excuse me, this is going to seem kind of obvious, but you got to remember, no one was talking about this kind of stuff back then. So you said there are 2 main branches of sociology. The first he called social statics, an analysis of the forces that hold societies together. What are the forces that hold societies together? Well, interestingly enough, having just said that theological stage is not a good thing, he acknowledged that religion is one of the things that can hold societies together. Right? There are people that are in communities together based upon religion, and it gives them a sense of community, it gives them a sense of togetherness and interconnectedness and things like that. But he also discovered or discussed that society also had causes of social change or things that drove people apart. And religion can be one of those too. And Durkheim talked about that as well. But there are lots of other things. Money drives people apart, right, too. Causes a lot of divorces and things like that, right? So he just begins to develop these ideas that there are social forces that influence behavior. Any questions? Yes? So, he was effectively a structural function. There was no structural functionalism that he was building sociology, but if you look back today, he was essentially a structural functionalists don't get into whether they believe in, they look at the functions of things in society. So he acknowledged that religion can have a positive, serve a positive function in society. But he also, and we're going to talk about this in the chapter about religion, about what sociologists are supposed to do with religion. It wasn't that he believed or didn't believe, he acknowledged the function of religion in society. So that would be what he would disclose publicly. He's not supposed to Sociologists will say, we don't. They're supposed to discuss it in objective. Excuse me, objective. I'm not sure that answers the question. That's the best answer. Okay. So we move on from Comte, and we now get to Spencer. Now, I gave you Spencer on the list of which sociological perspective each of the theorists was associated with. Who can remember what perspective Spencer was associated with? You can look at it. I don't expect you to remember. Yes. He was a structural function. He was one of the first structural functions. Now, Comte was too, but he was busy building the big picture. So Spencer was more directly involved, and Spencer was considered to be a philosopher, a biologist, which becomes very important, an anthropologist, and a political theorist, in addition to being a sociologist. Excuse me. But that was typical at the beginning of sociology, to be more than just a sociologist. But what's the relationship to biology?
Debating whether or not something is a biological or social.
Okay. Thank you. Anyone else? Yes. That is definitely the structural function of this. Good. But what was his direct relationship to biology? You're right in the big picture. But what was Spencer's direct relationship to biology? I kind of discussed this with you last time, but before we get to that, he was influenced by and highly critical of Comte's work. But with respect to biology, he was the person who developed the idea of what? What was his main theory? Well, there's a couple of them. What was the one that we talked about? That's Durkheim. Yes? That's structural functionalism. And you're right. Again, both of you are right about that. Yes? That's structural function. Good. What was Spencer's direct relationship? He has a couple of theories that he developed. But what was the one he's best known for? And I talked about it with you. I know it's probably very quick. All right, so let's get to it. Right? He believed that human development was a natural outcome of individual achievement. Meaning, and I'll just get through it quickly because we're running out of time. Meaning, that he developed the idea of social Darwinism, which I think I mentioned this as well, means he was the one who developed the phrase survival of the fittest, not Charles Darwin. Darwin had ideas about natural selection and many of the same things about biology, about the ecology, but it was Spencer, who was thought to be a distant cousin of Charles Darwin, by the way. One more second. We have 6 minutes. He believed in this idea that the strongest will survive. Individual achievement was critical. So it sounds like Darwin's theory of natural selection, but he extrapolated this to humans. So in the study of sociology, this book, he wrote that the privileged members of society enjoyed that position because they had earned that status. Which, if you translate this into what was going on in the world, he was living in England, and who was the dominant controlling force in England? Yes? Well, yes, but directly it was the royal family, right? The church was important, but the royal family. So did they want him writing stuff that says that it's not natural for them to be in a position of power? So he was under a lot of pressure to kind of go along with the fact that they should be in a position of high status. He also argued, and this is the really controversial part of his theory of social Darwinism, that the government should not interfere with assisting those at the bottom of the social hierarchy. It would violate the natural order of things. That's the connection to biology, right? Maintain the food chain. You know, if some species of plankton becomes extinct, that's the way it should be. Those kinds of things. But he thought that should apply to humans, right? Homo sapiens. That it would violate the natural order. So think about it. What would that mean in today's world? There would be no social services, no welfare, no entitlements. If somebody was poor, they got to figure it out, and if they don't survive, he believed that is the way, the natural order of things. So just think about Native Americans, for example. Their population was dwindling. It is still very small, but they would have been gone in his world, right? Just as an example. Instead of having some assistance, getting government assistance, things like that. So that's why this is particularly controversial. He adapts, we have 3 minutes. He adapted Charles Darwin's biological theories to that of society, and it was Spencer, not Darwin, who used the term survival of the fittest. It correlated to what Darwin was talking about, but it was Spencer who used the term. So, last thing for today. Spencer's theory is considered to be social Darwinism. Any questions? Yes? Just speak up. He believed that they earned that right. It was a meritocracy. Yeah. Any questions? So we will finish up chapter 1, and I'm still planning on getting to chapter 2 next time. If we can't do that, then I'll make a decision. But right now, you should have read and taken notes for chapter 2, and we'll try to get everything done for next time. If not, then we will talk about what will be on the exam on Monday. But if not, see you on Friday.